As you know, this evening we're here with best-selling author Christian McBurney to hear about his latest book, Dark Voyage, an American Privateer's War on Britain's African Slave Trade. This is based on a little-known source by Newport Captain's Clerk, the Journal of the Good Ship Marlborough. Christian McBurney is going to discuss the remarkable voyage of Africa by this Rhode Island privateer, whose goal of advancing the cause of the Revolutionary War by attacking British slave forts and capturing British slave ships in Africa. He will highlight the mastermind behind the voyage, Merchant John Brown of Providence, the disturbing mixed motivations of Brown and his Rhode Island privateersmen, and the consequences of the attacks by Marlborough and other American privateers in disrupting Britain's slave trading industry. Christian McBurney has authored 6 books on the American Revolutionary War and is the editor of the online journal smallstatebighistory.com. While he practices law in Washington, D.C., he and his wife have a second home here in Rhode Island. And now I'd like to introduce Christian McBurney.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for attending today. I guess it's the first in-person lecture since pre-COVID time, so welcome. Welcome back. First, a couple things. You're welcome to buy the book, and I'm glad to sign it after my lecture. Put in a plug for the Newport Historical Society gift shop because they care. They created my books. So this one and the Rhode Island campaign, the first about the Battle of Rhode Island and the French and American operation to take over Newport during the Revolutionary War, and also World War II Rhode Island, what happened in Rhode Island during World War II. So they're great for history books. Secondly, as was said by Elizabeth, I'm the publisher of the website smallstatebighistory.com. How many of you already get my emails? Raise your hand. Oh, that's about half, but about half of you haven't. So you have to do something about that. I'll send around a sign-up list. What I do is I send out an article, one email a week, and in that email you can click on it, on the article for that week. So there'll be articles by me, there'll be articles by many other Rhode Island historians, including Ingrid Hughes of Newport Historical Society. If you do put down your email address, please do it neatly. And I've always gotten my pen back. So I'm sure you guys won't be the first, so I don't get my pen back. I don't have a clipboard. Okay. I'm going to try. How do you turn on the light? If you know the George Washington story, I'm getting blind in my service. Yeah, we had it working. Oh, it's okay. I'll survive. So I might have to pick it up. The contrast is glaring in the extreme. On the one hand, the American Revolutionary War from 1775 to 1783 was a glorious struggle for the causes of freedom, liberty, equality, and the dignity of the individual. Thomas Jefferson's rousing words in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, have inspired millions in our country and across the globe for almost 250 years. And the words resonate today in Ukraine. The word men originally was intended to apply only to adult males. But over time, its meaning is extended to adult women and persons of all colors, creeds, and races. Democracy, the rule of the many and not just the few, representative balanced government, the rule of law, these and other institutions are gifts that the United States bestowed on the world as a result of the American Revolution. Yet at the same time that the American Revolutionary War was about to commence, one of the worst tragedies in human history was continuing unabated. The African slave trade. European and American merchants sent ships across the ocean to purchase African captives and to carry them to the Caribbean and other parts of North America, Brazil, and mainland North America. At the time, Great Britain dominated the African slave trade, but other European countries participated in as well, even Sweden. And, of course, what would become the United States also participated in. Between 1771 and 1775 alone, on average, each year, more than 90,000 African captives were carried across the Atlantic Ocean to the New World. There, they were forced into a lifetime of permanent bondage and unpaid work, with their children consigned to the same unimaginably miserable fate. The captives were taken away from their families and their friends, never to return. It was a horrible, abominable trade, and it's mind-boggling to believe it ever existed, particularly by today's moral standards. Okay, you can see here some of the numbers. 1642 to 1807, Great Britain clearly forced over the highest number of African captives. You can see that Portugal was close second. Throughout the history of the African slave trade, it actually is number one. It started a lot earlier than Great Britain, and Great Britain ended in 1807, and Portugal continued a lot more years afterwards. Here's a image of the slave ship Blandford, 1760, and here is even a scene of African slave trading on the coast of Africa. So they're celebrating this image. Celebrates their slave trading past. In the first 3 quarters of the 18th century, Great Britain was the world's leading slave trading country. The year 1775, so important to American Revolutionary War history, Lexington conquered, Battle of Bunker Hill, was the zenith of the Great Britain's African slave trade. British merchants from Liverpool, Bristol, and London annually sent over 150 to 200 slave ships per year to the west coast of Africa and purchased, on the average, about 40,000 enslaved people. The British vessels transported their captives across the Atlantic Ocean and landed them mostly in colonial possessions of Britain, such as Jamaica, Barbados, and Antigua. In the quarter century prior to the American Revolution, Great Britain's domination of the Atlantic slave trade peaked. So you can see these numbers. Great Britain way ahead. What would become the United States, pretty small in comparison. A British, oh, that's somebody's phone. Look at all the silence your phones. Appreciate it. A British slave plane voyage typically had 3 legs, thus giving it the name the Triangle of Trade. Starting from Britain, the merchants would have their slave ships going to Africa with English manufactured goods like gunpowder, guns, textiles, china, and they would be used to trade for African captives. Here's another slave trade you can see on the coast. Then the ship carried the captives across the Atlantic through the dreaded Middle Passage, which was a 6-week or so voyage from Africa to the Americas. The ship's destination, again, was usually Jamaica, Barbados, Antigua, or another British colony, where the surviving captives would be ultimately sold to local plantation owners. Next, the captains of the ship would purchase sugar and other products from sugar, rum, and molasses, to bring back to Britain to sell to British wholesalers. Sugar was the key. Europe craved sugar, which was almost unknown in the 17th century. The English loved sugar in their cookies, cakes, coffee, and tea. The value of sugar imports and related products, molasses and rum, far exceeded the value of any other import, including tobacco from Virginia and rice and indigo from South Carolina. Sugar remained Britain's most valuable import until 1820. Slave labor was indispensable to the production of sugar. Plantation owners in the Caribbean used gangs of enslaved labor to cultivate, harvest, and process sugar cane into sugar. The process of converting sugar cane into sugar was brutal work, huge vats under fires, and the planting would be staggered so that for 6 months of the year it was harvested. All this great increase in our treasure, wrote a British observer as early as 1729, proceeds chiefly from the labor of Negroes in the plantations. Now, if slave labor was the key to successful sugar plantations, the African slave trade was the key to the continuation of slave labor. These plantation owners actually needed new African captives, thousands of them, each year to come in to replace the ones that they lost. An outstanding feature of the British Caribbean plantation slavery in the mid-18th century was that natural births of enslaved people failed to exceed natural and unnatural deaths. This was primarily because the rates of the enslaved in the British Caribbean were shockingly high. Poor food, primitive living conditions, and overwork left enslaved people vulnerable to deadly diseases, and the child mortality rate was also abominable. The first 3 years or so of a newly imported enslaved individual's life was called the seasoning period, and it took a heavy toll. After arriving in a weekend state already after going across the Middle Passage, 6-week or so voyage, the new arrivals had to adjust to new work, food, diseases, and rules. And an estimated 20% of the captives died in the seasoning period. Here's another drawing of slave trading. This one's arguably more accurate than this one. Is all white people, but most of the intermediaries on the coast were Africans. There were some whites. Here you have Africans, workers, freemen, rowing the enslaved captives to the white European slave ship. Here's an example of a famous picture of tight packing in slave ships to try to strand as many captives as possible on the ship. And here's the autobiography of Olada Equiano. He had one of the first descriptions of the Middle Passage, one of the only ones we have. And he later became free and quite a prominent abolitionist in London. And he wrote this autobiography. British Caribbean planters intentionally provided their enslaved people with minimal food, shelter, and clothing. They made the mind-boggling calculus that as long as the slave trade persisted, it was cheaper to purchase new captives than to spend money on the captives that they actually had purchased previously. As a result of the high mortality rate among the enslaved and the low natural birth rate, the British Caribbean planters had to import massive numbers of African captives just to maintain their slave populations. You can see these numbers in the 25-year period before the American Revolution. Hundreds of thousands. Perhaps the most devastating statistic is to compare the number of Africans carried to the British Caribbean to their populations when slavery was prohibited. Historian Adam Hochschild writes, when slavery ended in the United States in 1865, less than 500,000 slaves imported over the century had grown to a population of nearly 4 million. By comparison, notes the same author, when slavery ended in the British Caribbean in 1834, total slave imports of well over 2 million left a surviving slave population of only 670,000. After reviewing his statistics, Hochschild concludes the British Caribbean was a slaughterhouse. Now, readers may be surprised to learn that merchants, what would become the United States and later became the United States, overall played a comparatively small role in the African slave trade compared to Great Britain. While the slave trade lasted, they carried about 292,000 African captives across the Atlantic and outfitted about 2.4% of all slavery voyages. Here's an advertisement in Charleston, South Carolina newspaper. Henry Lawrence is advertising slaves that just were delivered from Africa. He was probably the biggest slave trader in North America. And he later became the president of the Continental Congress. Rhode Island dominated the slave trade among the 13 mainland colonies. More than half of the North American slave trading voyages in colonial times emanated from Rhode Island, with the rest coming mostly from New York City, Boston, and other New England ports. Newport, Rhode Island was by far the dominant slave trading port in North America. Now, why did Rhode Island, tiny Rhode Island, dominate the slave trade? It's not clear, but Rhode Island merchants lacked the hinterland that merchants in Boston, New York, and Charleston had. So New York merchants, for example, had a huge Hudson Valley they could draw on farms there. Newport merchants, there was a little bit of Middletown, Portsmouth, the Narragansett country had some rich farmlands, but pretty small. So they needed to look elsewhere. And they found that they could take molasses from the Caribbean and distill it into rum. So Newport had a lot of distilleries. Most of that rum was used here in New England or transported to Europe. But about 25% of it, they found out the best way to sell it was in the slave trade. So Rhode Island rum became the preferred liquor for trading captives on Africa's Gold Coast. African sellers of captives sometimes called Rhode Island slave ship captains rummen. Yet while the importance of the slave trade to Newport's economy is significant and undeniable, its role has sometimes been exaggerated. I read some quotes by Newporters, maybe somebody here, who claimed that their city's historic houses were built on the slave trade. Yet on the average, in the 1760s and early 1770s, Newport sent out about 350 voyages in the North American coastal trade and 180 voyages in the foreign trade. On the average, Newport sent out only about 20 slave ships to Africa per year. That's only 3.6% of all its voyages. Now, with a slave voyage, you should count that more because it was a big investment and the slave voyages often lasted a year or more. So I would multiply them by a factor of 4. But that still gets you to 14%. Here's a great image called Sea Captains Carousing in Suriname. It's a painting in the St. Louis Art Museum. And there are a number of Rhode Island merchants there and future governors, and most certainly slave traders. You can see some African servants in the image here, up in the corner. And this guy's getting vomit in his pants and rum on his head. So. Now, while Rhode Island was a small player in the worldwide slave trade prior to the American Revolution, carrying the average about 2,400 African captives per year, as the decades passed, that became a pretty large number. In all, over 59,000 Africans were involuntarily taken aboard Rhode Island ships in the colonial period, 90% at least from Newport. The human suffering Rhode Island slavers caused African captives and their families left behind is impossible to measure. But matters were beginning to change. The American Revolution was a crucial catalyst for the worldwide anti-slavery movement. It was, in fact, prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, the most important event in America promoting the anti-slavery cause. When the rebellion against the Crown rule began, there was little anti-slavery activity anywhere in the world. Britain's anti-slavery movement really didn't begin until about 1787. As with any great worldwide movement, the anti-slavery campaign made slow progress in fits and starts, but the American Revolution definitely brought significant progress. Before the war, slavery existed in every one of the 13 colonies. Rhode Island had the highest percentage of African Americans in New England. After the war, mostly through legislation, each state in the North eventually ended the institution of slavery, and all states banned the importation of African captives. This was probably the first time in world history where something like this had occurred. The American Revolution thus proved to be a major leap forward for the cause of abolitionism. But slavery continued in the South, as we know, where it was much more important economically. Thus, there was still a long road ahead to ending slavery and treating black people as political and social equals. with the American colonists denouncing the British plot to enslave them. The word was used all the time, including in the book I'm reading now by George Washington. The British plot to enslave them by imposing taxes without representation. It's not surprising that patriots looked around and said, hey, we're actually enslaving people. As early as 1763, the great patriot orator James Otis of Massachusetts, in an influential pamphlet arguing that colonists ought not to be taxed without their consent, asserted that there were laws higher than the Acts of Parliament. While not necessary to do so to make his main point, Otis delved into race relations. He exclaimed, "The colonists are by the law of nature free-born men, as indeed are all men, white or black. Does it follow that 'tis right to enslave a man because he is black?" Speaking of the African slave trade, he said, "Nothing better can be said in favor of a trade that is the most shocking violation of the law of nature." This was very new. Before then, we didn't hear much in New England, including Congregationalist ministers. But here's when things were changing. This is John Allen's pamphlet. He was a minister outside Boston, and he wrote this pamphlet to celebrate the burning of the Gaspee, which he called one of the important acts of resistance against British tyranny. This was one of the most popular pamphlets in colonial times. In his fourth edition, he adds anti-slavery language, anti-slave trade language. Pretty surprising. In the lead-up to the American Revolution, most legislatures passed laws to limit or try to ban the importation of African captives. But government officials in London revoked these laws. They did not want any interference with the profitable slave trade. It was only after the American Revolution began that the states passed those laws. My new book brings together the glory of the American Revolutionary War and the horror of the African slave trade together in one tale. The tale is told through the extraordinary voyage of a Rhode Island privateer, Marlborough, to West Africa, and the men who sailed on it with the bold goal of attacking British slave trading interests. Now, why would a privateer sail to faraway West Africa? Privateers typically would sail to the Caribbean and capture British sugar ships there. They would sail up the Canadian coast and capture British military supply ships going to Canada and Quebec. But Africa, no privateer was known to have sailed there before. The story starts in Providence, Rhode Island, with John Brown, the main investor and the mastermind behind the voyage. Brown was, of course, a member of the Brown family of Providence, among the most successful merchants in Rhode Island, and he helped lead the resistance against the Gaspee and the burning of the Gaspee. He was also an early investor in an iron foundry, which manufactured over 1,000 cannon, sold mostly to privateers. When the war started, he generated more profits as a military contractor, selling gunpowder, buying and selling gunpowder to the Continental Congress and supplies. Here's an image of John Brown by Edward Malbon, who spent some time in Newport. This is in the New York Historical Society. In 1776 and 1777, Brown got really rich as an investor in privateers. During the war, the Continental Navy was no match for the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy was by far the strongest maritime power in the world. America's most effective weapon by far was privateering, the operation of privately owned commerce raiders. From British ships, Americans captured gunpowder, muskets, cannon, food, blankets, and other supplies desperately needed not only by the Continental Army, but also the state militias. For example, in the Battle of Rhode Island, there, in my book, The Rhode Island Campaign, the chapter on the siege of Rhode Island, they had some huge mortars, cannon. Those were captured by privateers on British military supply ships, and they were stored up at Springfield at the armory there, and then brought down here. Privateers were not pirates. Pirates operated outside of any government oversight and solely for their own personal gain. Privateers were sanctioned by the government to attack only enemy shipping, so they couldn't attack neutral countries. They were required to follow an elaborate set of rules, including respecting the rights of neutral vessels, country vessels, and treating prisoners humanely. A violation of any of these prohibitions could result in the loss of the privateer's commission or prize. Once an enemy vessel was captured, the captain of the privateer would typically select from the ship a prize master and a small prize crew to sail the captured vessel to a safe U.S. port so that the prize could be adjudicated by an admiralty court. Here in Rhode Island, that admiralty court was in Providence. The admiralty court would conduct a trial by jury to determine whether the prize was lawfully taken from an enemy vessel. And if it was, if the jury decided yes, it's a valid prize, it would be sold at public auction. And the net proceeds would be divided at the court costs, 50% to the investors and 50% to the officers and crew of the privateer. Here's an ad showing a privateer ship, but selling public auction of some cargo captured by a privateer from Baltimore. Many who enlisted with an American privateer had mixed motives of patriotism and economic self-interest. Christopher Prince, when he joined the crews of New England privateers, wrote that he had two motives in mind. One was for the freedom of my country, and the other was to enjoy the luxuries of life. Samuel Phillips, a neighbor of George Babcock's in North Kingston, we'll learn about Babcock, would serve as lieutenant on 4 privateering voyages, including 2 with Babcock and 1 as a commander. He was caught and imprisoned in filthy, dirty British jails 3 times. Yet Phillips was proud of his service. After the war, he wrote, "I have ever striven hard and suffered much to help gain the independence of my country, which I ever held near and dear to me." But if privateersmen were honest with themselves, I think they would say, yes, I'm primarily motivated by financial gain. If they were primarily motivated by patriotism, they would have joined the Continental Navy and Army, which didn't pay as much. Yet privateers sometimes engaged in fierce contests with Royal Navy warships, as well as with British and Loyalist privateers. The captain of the Marlborough, George W. Babcock, in his career never shrank from fighting against an enemy ship. He fought 5 fierce battles against well-armed enemy ships, which are described in the book. In the early years of the war, the Royal Navy did not do a good job protecting British merchant ships, including sugar ships. As a result, American privateers easily seized hundreds of merchant ships sailing between Britain and both the Caribbean and Canada. Oftentimes, they're very small boats, like 8 cannon and 20 crew members. But the merchant ships often had only 1 or 2 cannon and even smaller crew. Soon, Providence became awash in surplus goods and supplies. Providence, because that's where the Admiralty Court was. There were Newport privateers that would take their prizes to Providence. The Reverend Ezra Stiles from Newport wrote that some 40 prizes had been brought into Providence by October 1776, all but 3 of which had been engaged in the sugar trade between British and the Caribbean colonies. Young John Howland, who would become the founder of the Rhode Island Historical Society, returned to Providence in early 1777 after performing grueling service as a private in the Rhode Island Infantry Regiment with Washington's half-starved army. He recalled, "The year 1776 in Providence was mostly employed in privateering, and many whom I had left in poor circumstances were now rich men. The wharves in Providence were crowded with large ships from Jamaica and other islands, loaded with rich products." And there's a map of Providence, and John Brown's wharf would have been located in the lower right there. While privateering was risky, the rewards were phenomenal. I discovered by reviewing John Brown's privateering records that it cost him relatively little to outfit and purchase a privateer compared to the value of a British merchant ship that he could capture. On average, it cost Brown about £4,400 to purchase and outfit a small privateer sloop carrying around 8 cannon. But the average value of a single large British merchant ship brought into Providence as a prize was more than £9,000. So that was one single prize. Thus, one capture on a privateering voyage could pay for 2 or 3 more. Brown invested in 11 privateers in 1776 and 1777, and he became rich. But warning signs were ahead. The days of the easy conquests in 1776 eventually ended. powerful Royal Navy warships began protecting commercial vessels and convoys and seizing privateers. Most of the crews of the captured privateers were sent to horrid British jails, which many died. Most of the jails in New York City and back in Britain, but one here in a British ship in Newport as well. Merchant ships, especially slave ships, began to arm themselves with more cannon. Brown decided in the second half of 1777 that with his new wartime profits, he could afford to construct a large privateer that would carry at least 20 cannon. That was big for a privateer. Such a privateer could avoid being captured by a Royal Navy sloop of war and could defeat armed merchantmen. But he didn't want his ship captured by a 32-gun frigate. A lot of the frigates, the 32-gun frigate was much more powerful than any privateer, just as fast, if not faster. What to do? Brown had the brilliant idea of sending his new privateer to the coast of West Africa. Brown figured correctly that the Royal Navy was overstretched. It had to transport the British Army in its ships, to convoy merchant ships, blockade American ports, seek out privateers, and most importantly, take care about a possible invasion by the French across the English Channel. The Royal Navy had few ships remaining to patrol the faraway African coast and protect British slave forts and slave ships. It took an experienced privateer investor and a bold man to decide to send a privateer to distant Africa. Brown had both of these qualities, but then so did a lot of privateer investors, the guys from Salem and Boston, Newport. What gave Brown the edge was his familiarity with the African slave trade. Excuse me. Now, Brown, first he came from around, so Brown came from around the colony that was most involved in slave trade. So he could talk with returning slave ship captains and find out, hey, are there any Royal Navy slave ships patrolling the coast of West Africa? And if there weren't, that would give his privateer free rein to attack slave trade interests. Second, Brown himself was an experienced slave trade investor. He had personally invested in 2 slaving voyages previously, one in 1763 and one in 1769. The first one was the ship Sally, commanded by E.C. Hopkins. There he is. He was one of Brown's favorite sea captains. He wasn't normally a slave trading captain, and Brown's couldn't find an experienced one, so they asked Hopkins to captain this voyage. Hopkins would later become the first commander-in-chief of the Continental Navy. This voyage of the Sally became one of the most deadly in the history of North American slave trade. Of the 196 Africans purchased by Hopkins, at least 109 perished during the voyage. A slave trading voyage was daunting in part because a slave ship loaded with goods to trade with African captives was typically not large enough to carry all the food and fresh drinking water the crew needed for the long voyage. So the ships got crammed with rum and different things to trade with captives. Enough food and water to get to Africa, but once you got there, you had to negotiate with local African chieftains. That was a daunting prospect for a lot of privateer investors, but not John Brown. He had experience with that. Now, was Brown motivated to attack Britain, the world's leading slave trading country, and in Africa for humanitarian impulses to aid Africans? Clearly not. He did want to harm British economic interests, and the slave trade was an important part of Britain's economy. And at the same time, he wanted to earn profits. Big ones. A privateer sent to Africa could attack and plunder slave trading posts established by British slave traders. Such posts would typically contain warehouses full of rum, gin, or other British slave trading products. So if a privateer captured them, they would just stuff all those goods into their privateer ship. In addition, there were often African captives at these slave posts. The whole point was that they would be traded for, kept at the slave trading posts, and when a European British slave ship came by, it was easy to purchase the captives in one place. The alternative was to go village to village to village along the coast. That was a slow process. So these captives who were held at these British slave trading posts could also be captured. Moreover, British slave ships with human cargo on board could be seized, whose captains would be surprised by the appearance of a strong American privateer so far from its home port. If Brown was really fortunate, he figured, his privateer could capture a large British slave ship filled with African captives ready to go to the Caribbean islands. In such a situation, the ship would have spent perhaps a year from leaving its home port, most of the time in Africa, trying to purchase the captives. And they were just about to cash in by sailing across the ocean to the Caribbean. Brown's privateer could simply step in and snap the slave ship and its human cargo as a prize of war. The prize crew would be put on board and would sail the slave ship in the middle passage and try to arrive at a safe port, probably Martinique or Guadeloupe, one of the French colonies, or Charleston, South Carolina, or Savannah, Georgia. There, the enslaved Africans would be sold. So they would be sold just like any cargo. Then the Browns and his investors would really cash in. A few other patriots had considered an expedition to Africa. One of them was John Paul Jones, who would turn out to be the greatest hero of the Continental Navy of the war. There's an image of Jones. While stationed here in Newport in October 1776, Jones recommended to Congress that he command a small expedition of Continental Navy ships to sail to Africa. He was sure that his ships would, I quote, carry all before them and give a blow to the English trade which would not soon recover. The expedition did not get off the ground for various reasons, but Jones knew what he was talking about. As a young man, he had worked on 2 slaving voyages, one out of his home port of Whitehaven, England. Now, Brown was also aware from reading newspapers that beginning in early 1777, American privateers started to capture British slave ships. In one, there was a desperate fight between a British slave ship that had left Bristol, was on its way to Africa, so it didn't have slave ships. And the Americans got a lucky shot, hit gunpowder inside the British slave ship, and the ship exploded, killing all on board but 3. But in most cases, the American privateers would sally out for a couple of hours out of Martinique or Guadeloupe, and they would capture British slave ships just as they were arriving at Barbados and Antigua. Then they would sail their captive ships with their cargo to the French Caribbean island, and they would sell the enslaved people to French plantation owners. At this point, the American privateers became slave traders themselves. Brown had a new 20-gun brig constructed in Providence. He named his privateer the Marlborough, after the Duke of Marlborough, a descendant of Winston Churchill. Here's a magnificent model of a ship that I think looks like the Marlborough would look like. It's in a museum in Germany, Hamburg, Germany. Now, to make the voyage a success, Brown had to find a courageous ship captain. He found one in George Wade Babcock, Exeter, Rhode Island. Now, Exeter is a township, you might know, it's landlocked. Was known for small stony farms, but it was close to the small, thriving port of what is now called Wickford in North Kingston. After moving to Wickford, Babcock showed leadership skills by forming and commanding an independent regiment that intimidated local Tories. That area of North Kingston was a hotbed of Toryism. Babcock had also served as an officer on some privateers, including one as a second lieutenant on one of John Brown's privateers. So that's how Brown got to know him. Babcock would turn out to be a bold and sensible commander of the Marlborough, and one of the top privateer captains of the war. Babcock hired most of his officers and his crew from North Kingstown and Exeter from the people who knew him best. Here's from the commission for the Marlborough, the signatures of George Babcock and John Brown. Now, here's an image of what's called black sailor, black privateersman. And I show this because black sailors were on the privateers. I saw one roll from the privateer Independence out of Providence. 3 out of 60 were clearly black men, and probably more because they had English-sounding names. Were any black men on the Marlborough? No. You can imagine they're going to Africa. Now, this painting actually belonged to my father. He bought it in 1971 in Charlestown, Rhode Island. And it's been shown in several books, in museums. And he was asked to show it at a particular museum and got a little suspicious, so he had an x-ray. Turns out that someone painted the black face and the black skin. So the painting itself is original from the Revolutionary War. That's probably a privateer in the background there. But someone had painted the skin. Now it's still valuable because it's a black face representing that blacks did sail on privateer ships. And also someday I plan to donate it to the Newport Historical Society. All right, at the time Newport was occupied by the British Army and Narragansett Bay was blockaded by Royal Navy ships. Brown and Babcock had to find a way for the Marlborough to break through the blockade. The ship did so on a stormy night on Christmas night in 1777, but it was a very close call. The ship got grounded and a British ship was after it. But he escaped out of the Narragansett Bay, sailed on to Martha's Vineyard, where he enlisted more sailors. Finally, the ship departed for Africa on January 2nd, 1778. So here's a map showing the movements of the Marlborough in Narragansett Bay, and finally escaped down the Sakonnet River. The Sakonnet River was more shallow, so the bigger 32-ton and 50-gun vessels could sail there. So there was only one he had to deal with, 14-gun boat. Thus began the extraordinary voyage of the Marlborough to Africa and back. Now, what we know about the voyage is primarily from a ship's log kept by John Linscomb Boss, the captain's clerk who hailed from Newport. Boss dutifully recorded the important events of each day. Here's the cover page. Now, I was given a copy of the log from the Navy History and Heritage Command, so I'm very lucky to get it from them. And the original was said to be held by the Morristown National Historic Park. And so I called them up. I always like to feel the original. Maybe you see something in the original that you don't get in the copy. They couldn't find it. Lost. Or possibly stolen. The copy was probably from the 50s or early 60s. I don't have time to provide the details of the voyage of the Marlborough to you. You have to read the book for that. Suffice it to say that it was a remarkable journey, and from Brown's and Babcock's viewpoints, a successful one. Here are some of the notable events in short form. The New England privateersmen were able to sack a major slave trading post in Africa, British one. They also captured several armed British slave ships and sailed them as prize ships back to North America. 4 of them. One of them actually held 310 African captives and was just about to leave for the Caribbean, just as John Brown hoped. Babcock captured, and then also the Marlborough itself came back to New Bedford with 26 enslaved captives. Babcock captured several British slave ships, I already said that. He also captured several British slave ships, with both African captives and free American workers on board. And consistent with his privateering commission, he kept the captives as cargo, but allowed the workers to be released. During their time on the west coast of Africa, Babcock worked with several African leaders who cooperated with the New Englanders. One of them was named King Tom. He had served as an intermediary for European and American slave ship captains for decades, but he helped out Babcock. Several British slave ship captains captured by Babcock greedily agreed to cooperate with the Americans by giving them valuable intelligence, even though that meant committing treason against their country, Britain. The reason they did it was if they cooperated, Babcock would give them back their ship. So they were more interested in that. Here's some more drawings. This is an excellent portrayal of maritime life on the coast. You can see canoes were very important for communicating and transporting cargo and enslaved people between the coast and the British and slave ships, as you can see at the distance. Here's an important watercolor done by a British slave ship captain. It's showing the Fantee tribesmen marching captives from their wars to the coast. Now, in this area where Marlborough was acting, most of the prisoners were probably resulting from wars in the interior by Muslim warriors trying to expand their empire against pagan countries. So a lot of the captives, most of the captives were probably prisoners of war brought to the coast. Here's a drawing of the slave trading post that Babcock and the Marlborough sacked. So it had, would have had facilities for repairing slave ships, anchors and rigging. Would have had a pen for enslaved people. Had a lot of warehouses full of goods, which a lot of goods that the Marlborough captured. Here's a map showing the top, the voyage of the Marlborough in the back, and also some of the prize ships that they captured, the slaves of war. There are a number of original documents. This is one, orders given by George Babcock. You see his signature at the bottom of the page. To Francis Bradstreet from Bradfield, from North Kingstown. He's the prize ship captain of this ship that had 310 captives on board. And he's ordering very detailed instructions. First, you go to the Martinique and you try to sell to this French merchant house, and that kind of thing. I actually found this in a Google search of an auction site, tracked it down, and it's now held by Cornell University. Now, the Marlborough damaged the British slave trade more than any other American privateer. In the last chapter of my book, I argue that the actions of the officers and sailors of the Marlborough, as well as other American privateers who intercepted British slave ships at sea, had a stunning unintended consequence. The British slave trade by 1778 had not only been disrupted, it had virtually collapsed. The American privateersmen interfered with the conduct of the British slave trade to such an extent that British slave merchants substantially reduced their investments in African merchants, in African slave voyages. By 1778, that reduction was as much as 70%. As a result, during the early years of the Revolutionary War, the number of enslaved Africans forcibly shipped across the Atlantic Ocean declined dramatically, I estimate by as many as 60,000, probably more. This is the first book to detail and emphasize the role of American privateers in disrupting the British slave trade. Appendix B to the book describes 26 captures of British slave ships by American privateers without British African captives on board. Appendix C lists and describes captures of 41 British slave ships with an estimated 11,000 enslaved people on board. The stories behind the captures are remarkable, and prominent British slave trade historians who reviewed my manuscript were surprised at the new material they found. And there's a map of the Caribbean. You can see a slave worker with boxes of sugar up in the corner. Barbados was the island closest to Africa, so a lot of the ships would see that and sail for there. But if you had to sail to Jamaica, that was another 1,000 miles, so much more suffering for the African captains to go another 1,000 miles. On the other hand, on a personal level, the men of the Marlborough and other American privateersmen desperately wanted to seize British slave ships filled with enslaved Africans for their own selfish and awful interests. When they did capture British slave ships, they became slave traders themselves, hoping to sell their captives for as high a price as possible. They did not show compassion for the hundreds of captives crammed aboard British slave ships they captured, or worried about the trauma that the captives had already suffered. Instead, the Americans sought to treat the captives the same as any non-human cargo seized on board an enemy ship. While such a motive at the time was not seen as offensive by many Americans, by today's standards, it's outrageous. The unintended beneficiaries of this war at sea on the slave trade were Africans, who otherwise might have been sold to British slave ship captains and carried across the Atlantic Ocean. The officers and sailors on the Marlborough and other American privateersmen who intercepted the British slave ships did not have the humanitarian goal of helping Africans, far from it. Still, their actions did substantially reduce the African slave trade and prevent tens of thousands of Africans from being forcibly removed from Africa. This was a positive impact, even if the reduction was both unintended and temporary. The privateersmen must be viewed as heroes or villains, or both. Thank you. Glad to take any questions.
Is it known how many people opposed this at the time, other than, you know about Moses Brown, but the local people here? Would there be any information about that?
Slavery and slave trade, too?
About the trade that was going on in Newport.
I think as a result of the American Revolution, there was a lot more anti-slavery sentiment. Now, a lot of the colonies waited, the states waited until after the war was over. They didn't want to necessarily upset South Carolina, Georgia, and Virginia by proposing legislation to free their slaves. They wanted to keep a single unified front to the British. And ultimately, of course, we gained independence from Britain. But once the war ended, a lot of the former colonies started to pass legislation freeing slaves. Rhode Island in 1784 passed gradual emancipation, and in 1779, I believe, they pretty much prohibited the slave trade. So you see a lot of this, some during the Revolution, most of it immediately after the Revolution, in the North. But even every state banned the African slave trade, importing Africans into their states. South Carolina, unfortunately, in 1804, decided to lift that ban, and a lot of slave ships from Newport or Bristol satisfied that demand, unfortunately.
At the time of the early Revolutionary War, in Newport, I've often wondered myself who actually lived in Newport besides the British and the Africans, and free or unfree in Newport. There weren't that many Irish here then. There were no Italians, they hadn't come through yet. So my thought is that when people say to me that the streets of Newport were built by Africans, cobblestones, and then I think, well, who the heck built all these houses that are that old, that surround the cobblestones? So I know many of them were still slaves, but there were some free. But I think my main question is, during that time, what was the population and how tumultuous was it during the 1777 to 1778?
During the British occupation, you're saying?
Yeah.
Well, the British occupied Newport from December 1776 to October 1779. Before then, a lot of the patriots had evacuated. They knew the Newport.
They fled.
Yeah, they fled. Ezra Stiles, for example, went up to Massachusetts, kept out of town. But a lot of their houses were destroyed by the British occupation. The British soldiers needed wood, and knew no one was there, so they would take pieces of wood before you know it, the building was destroyed. But it was about, I'd say about half the people stayed. Some Newport did have loyalists, some were neutral, some that wanted to, the patriots, but they wanted to protect their property. So most of them were white, Anglo people, but there were was also a sailor town, so you had a lot of people from all over the world, actually. But during that time, there wasn't much merchant business going on, British people allowed. I don't remember what the percentage of the population of African Americans in Newport was. It was generally around 10%. Anything else?
Do you happen to know, did John Brown ever change his views on the slavery?
Did John Brown change his views on slavery? No, he never did.
Never did.
Never did. As a matter of fact, in a couple of weeks, I'll be publishing an article on small state big history on Rhode Island U.S. senators and congressmen who held slaves. So the point is, they might have been more motivated to not support anti-slavery legislation. John Brown certainly did. He fought, had legendary fights with his brother Moses Brown. Moses Brown did hold slaves at one point. Then he had a conversion to Quakerism and also a conversion to his attitude towards slavery. And he was actually a very effective abolitionist leader in Rhode Island. So he fought against John Brown, but never convinced him. Brown had a total of 6 investments in Voyage. You could argue this is a 7th.